Welcome to the podcast that uncovers how human errors, oversights, and misjudgments have led to some of history's biggest failures. I'm Eckhard Jan, and this is Error 1. On May 25, 2008, the weather in Brussels was beautiful. 19 degrees Celsius, scattered clouds. Wind at the airport was from 210 with just 6 knots. Perfect conditions for a smooth takeoff on runway 20 as the massive Boeing 747 from Kalitta Air lines up on the runway. 3 crew members in the cockpit. The 4 engines are roaring. Everything is ready for takeoff. The aircraft accelerates. 100 knots, 120, 150, just seconds away from liftoff, and then a loud bang. In an instant, the pilots have to make a choice: abort or continue. One decision that will define the next few seconds and nearly cost them their lives. They abort, but the runway is too short to stop. The giant freighter overruns the runway end and 300 meters beyond comes to a stop as it breaks apart. In an instant, the perfect conditions have turned into a nightmare for the pilots. So imagine being in that cockpit. You're racing down the runway, everything sounds normal, until suddenly there's a loud bang, and a split second you have to decide stop or go. Today we're going to talk about the exact moment, the Kalitta Air 747 in Brussels 2008, and what really happened behind that decision. To help us understand the accident, I'm joined by Nicolas de Moch, a business jet captain, safety professional, and the host of the podcast, The Essence of Safety. Through his podcast and professional work, Nicolas explores the deeper lessons behind accidents and incidents, what really drives human decisions, and how organizations can learn from failure rather than simply assigning blame. Nicolas, happy welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Nicolas, you've studied this case closely. So let's start right here. For the people who don't know Kalitta Air, who are they and what kind of operation were they running back then?
So Kalitta Air was basically founded by a racing driver, Conrad "Conny" Kalitta. He was mainly active in the 1950s to 1970s as a race driver. And initially he started off by trying to ship his own self-designed spare parts by air. And he bought a Cessna 310, I think, for that. But that kind of evolved into becoming a freight airline. He was carrying freight for the automotive industry and eventually operated as a regular cargo airline. Partly during one of the Gulf Wars, also for the US military. You may have seen their aircraft being parked around. I saw them recently in Madrid, for example. And quite interestingly, their call sign is Conny. And initially that made me think of the Super Constellation, but they're actually referring to the founder of that airline, who's still alive, Conrad "Conny" Kalitta. And today they operate around 30 wide bodies, mainly 777s and 747s. Back then, at the time of the event that we are going to talk about, they were operating 18 Boeing 747-200s, so the classic version of the 3-person cockpit, 2 pilots and 1 flight engineer.
So how and why do cargo airlines like Kalitta love the Boeing 747? Why is that? Is it really the ultimate workhorse of the skies?
Well, I guess it's the bulk, the volume they can carry. It's partly the fact that they can open the nose for easy access for freight, to insert the freight pallets. And of course, it's the range the 747 offers, especially transatlantic, especially at the time. I think nowadays the 777 is becoming more and more a replacement of the 747. But back then, that was the aircraft you needed as a cargo airline if you wanted to fly long-haul cargo.
Right. And why did they go to Brussels? What makes that airport such an important stop for international cargo flights? Why Brussels?
Because of its central location in Europe and because of its great infrastructure. Belgium actually has a couple of cargo airports. If you think about Liège, if you think about Ostend, and then Brussels as an international airport has a major cargo section. I guess it's the central location within Europe, the great infrastructure. Everything's there. You can easily get to all of Europe within 1 or 2 hours by truck. So I guess that's why.
Is it also used as a hub and spoke system or airport where they fly into it and then distribute the cargo pallets from amongst the airplanes?
I know that at least TNT had a hub in Liège at some time. I don't know if they still have because I'm not following cargo operations so closely. But I guess so. I guess it's all part of their hub and spoke principle that also applies for cargo operations. And for all the listeners who may not know what we are talking about is that you take the cargo from all the incoming flights and you distribute it to other flights going out. That's basically how major network airlines operate, but that's also how cargo airlines operate.
Yeah, cargo airlines do that by night, actually, right?
Yeah, that's the big difference. They do it by night. They fly in the evening and or late at night, and then fly out again in the next morning.
Yeah, I recall that in Cologne, for example, it's a big hub and spoke system for UPS as well. That's also very centrally located. First of all, there's they don't have a night curfew, so they can fly in and out at night. And then if there's any cargo which remains in Europe or in Germany, then it's been distributed. I guess that's pretty much the same in Brussels, I guess.
There's a big contrast between day and night operations at Cologne. If you go to Cologne during the day, there's not so much happening. But at night, it's really busy. It's incredibly busy. It's incredibly noisy. You constantly have cargo being brought from one place to the other. It's really literally a difference like day and night.
Much more so even in Leipzig. When you go to Leipzig, there's nothing going on during the day. You could think there is no airport at all. But it's the central location for DHL. And at night, it's like a beehive. It's amazing. It's really amazing. And unfortunately, it's far outside of the city of Leipzig, so there's not much a problem of noise pollution. But can you take us back to that day in Brussels? What happened during the takeoff run of that Kalitta 747?
Okay, so the event happened in May 2008. As we already discussed, it happened the aircraft involved was a Boeing 747-200. The crew was actually quite experienced. The captain was 59 years old, had accumulated a total of 15,000 flying hours, including 3,000 hours on the 747 and 2,500 of that as pilot in command. The first officer was not quite that experienced. He had 7,000 flying hours in total.
Which is not bad, actually, total hours.
Not at all, no. He was 48 years old, but he had only joined Kalitta recently, and he had just obtained his type rating for the 747 and had completed his line check only 2 months prior to the accident. So, meaning that he was only released to the line as a full first officer 2 months prior, and he had only accumulated 200 hours on type so far. And then you had the flight engineer, who was 53 years old, and he had accumulated 7,000 hours, exactly, the accident report says, exactly 1950 of those hours on the 747. Basically what Kalitta was doing was they were flying freight from New York JFK to Brussels, then on to Bahrain, and then via Dubai back to Brussels and New York. And this particular crew had come in the day prior from Bahrain. They
didn't fly from New York to Brussels, but they were deadheading or with another plane?
It doesn't say exactly, but it says they came off another flight. I assume they were actually actively working as a crew on that particular flight. They came in from Bahrain the day prior. They had 24 hours of rest, and now they were going to fly the aircraft back to Bahrain with new cargo. So the aircraft was pretty heavy. It was pretty well loaded. The maximum takeoff weight of a 747-200 is about 370,000 kilograms. This particular aircraft weighed 314,000 and something kilograms. So it was pretty well loaded. And the crew calculated the performance data for the flight, and that included the V1 and VR for that. And decided they were going to do a reduced takeoff.
Okay, V1, VR are the speeds that need to be calculated for each and every takeoff.
Exactly.
So it's decision speed and rotation speed.
Exactly. So the V1, as you know, is the so-called decision speed for takeoff. Up to this speed, the crew can abort the takeoff if something goes wrong. For instance, an engine problem. And that's basically the most trade scenario there. Once you have exceeded V1, once you're faster than the V1, you must continue the takeoff. You don't have any other choice because the runway remaining may not be sufficient to stop safely.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, once you have reached V1, even if you lose an engine, you can still safely take off. It may be a little bit longer to reach the required liftoff speed, but you will reach it and you can safely take off. So the V1...
At least that's what they calculated. But then something happened, So what happened exactly? Why did they abort the takeoff?
So the event happened in May 2008, and this particular 747-200 was about to take off for its flight to Bahrain. They were just in the middle of the takeoff and reaching the speed at which they can rotate and lift off, when suddenly there was a loud bang, there was a bird strike, and the crew rejected the takeoff. Meaning that instead of taking off, they decided to stop, but in the end it turned out that the runway wasn't sufficient, and they overran the runway and came to a stop beyond the runway, actually on the airport perimeter. And luckily, no one got hurt, everybody got out alive, but the aircraft was a complete loss. Broke in 2 pieces and had to be scuttled.
So let's talk about this V1 speed. What is it, or why is it so critical? Why is it such a critical moment during takeoff?
The V1 is the so-called decision speed for takeoff. Up to the speed, you can always abort the takeoff, you can always stop, and what we call rejecting the takeoff. And the remaining runway will always be sufficient to bring the aircraft to a stop. Beyond V1, once you have exceeded that speed, you must continue the takeoff, because the remaining runway will not be sufficient to bring the aircraft to a safe stop. Once you've reached V1 at the same time, even if you lose an engine, you can still safely reach the speed where you can lift off and you can continue the takeoff. Maybe it may take a little bit longer to get through that speed, but you will eventually reach it.
Okay, but so then now comes up the question, what happened? What was the moment? When did they reject the takeoff?
They rejected the takeoff slightly after V1. The first officer had just called out the V1 speed, and at this point they heard a loud bang, and 1 second later the captain decided to reject the takeoff. And by that time the aircraft had already reached a speed of 150 knots, where initially they had calculated their V1 speed for 138 knots.
So they were 12 knots beyond V1, meaning they were too late and they were not supposed to reject the takeoff. Is that correct?
At this point, that's the thing.
And is this also the reason why they couldn't stop on the runway? Normally, I mean, when you have, let's talk about Munich or Leipzig is also a long runway, and I would assume that Brussels also has a long runway. That's from my perspective and my experience, you normally have some buffer, you have some reserves, some extra meters available on your takeoff run. So how close and how critical was it that they were not able to stop on the runway?
Well, it was a routine takeoff, but it was at the limits at the same time. It may sound a little bit strange, but the crew did the takeoff calculations as they normally should, and they had assumed a wet runway for the takeoff performance calculations. Now, when you have a wet runway, the braking distance will be longer, and which means in turn that the V1 speed, that decision speed, must be lower so that the aircraft can still stop safely. So they had used their onboard computing system, a laptop basically, to calculate how much runway they would need, how much thrust they would need for the takeoff, and how much margin they would have left. And they found that actually they can take off safely with around 300 meters remaining of runway remaining. The crew had basically prepared for departure from runway 20 in Brussels. Now that runway is around 9,800 feet long, or 2,987 meters. And they had calculated that they would need around 2,600 of these 2,900 meters. So they would have had a margin of around 300 meters. They had decided to calculate the takeoff for a wet runway, which means that the V1 speed needs to be a little bit lower. And they decided to do a so-called reduced thrust takeoff, meaning that you don't apply the full thrust on the engines, but a reduced thrust that basically saves on engine wear and tear. Basically means that the engines will last longer. And they had calculated the resulting V1 speed of 138 knots and a rotation speed, meaning the speed at which pilots can pull back on the yoke and bring the nose of the aircraft up, of 157 knots. And again, based on all these assumptions, they came up with a margin of exactly 273 meters. So if you accelerate to that V1 speed, you have to abort at this point, and then you apply full braking, you would still have 273 meters left.
So why didn't they stop on the runway with this margin?
And that's the interesting question. There were a couple of things that really went wrong here. First of all, one mistake was certainly in the analysis, because there was no engine failure. The investigators found that after the brief loss of thrust, the engine recovered quickly. The aircraft had ingested a bird, and that led to a very short-lived loss of thrust and to some noise, a loud bang. But the engine in itself wasn't actually affected. The decision then to reject the takeoff after V1, meaning after having exceeded that speed, also meant that normally the runway length wouldn't be sufficient to actually stop the aircraft on the remaining runway. And then all the assumptions around rejected takeoffs are that you apply maximum braking. You use all the devices that you have available, braking, aerodynamic braking and thrust reverse, to bring the aircraft to a stop. Unfortunately, it looks like that the crew did not use maximum braking. The investigators found that if they had used maximum braking, brakes would have become so hot that probably the tires would have burst because of the heat development. But 14 out of the 16 tires were found completely intact. So the assumption on behalf of the investigators is that they basically did not apply maximum braking. The other thing is they probably also didn't use the speed brakes. Now that is a bit difficult to tell. Towards the investigators, the crew said that they had used the speed brakes, but the speed brake lever was found in the retracted position, and the speed brakes themselves were also found in the retracted position. After the event, of course. The investigators did a couple of calculations. They compared the expected performance of the aircraft when speed brakes are used and the expected performance when the speed brakes are not used, and compared that with the actual performance of the aircraft, and they found that the actual performance of the aircraft was somewhere in the middle. Meaning it's not really clear if they did use them or not use them. But it seems more likely, to be honest, that they didn't use them. And then the crew didn't use reverse thrust. They could always have used the thrust reverses on 2 out of the 4 engines. And they didn't do that either.
Wow. What you're explaining is now that we have several errors coming all together. You're saying that, first of all, there was a bird strike, but it was not an engine failure, number one. Then secondly, they aborted the takeoff beyond V1, assuming that a margin was sufficient, which was obviously not, because thirdly, they didn't use full brakes, and fourthly, no reversers, and lastly, no speed brakes.
Yeah, well, there's another thing that also went wrong. The assumption was that the crew assumed they would use the full length of runway 20 for the takeoff. Now, unfortunately, they lined up on the wrong position on the runway. They, in essence, did a so-called intersection takeoff, meaning that you use not the beginning of the runway, but one of the taxiways leading to the runway as the starting point for your takeoff. By not using the full runway length, they essentially lost 300 meters. So essentially the margin they had was eaten up by them not using the full length of the runway, but starting from an intersection.
All right, so another error. So it's a lengthy error chain already building up. One question to this, would they have been required to make a backtrack on the runway to use these 300 extra meters in order to utilize the entire runway?
The runway layout in Brussels is such that if they wanted to use the full length of the runway, they would have needed to tell air traffic control ahead of time and use a completely different taxiway to get to that point, which they didn't.
All right. Okay, so it's truly an intersection takeoff then. How did the investigators explain this error? Just assuming that they'll be fine when they do an intersection takeoff.
So there were a couple of reasons why they probably didn't see that. First of all, if you look at the airport layout and at the airport chart, there was a so-called displaced threshold, which basically means you have a part of the runway ahead of the runway, so to say. This initial bit of the runway cannot be used for landings. It can only be used for takeoffs. And in Brussels, this bit is used for parts of the approach lighting system. It also overlaps the runway 25 right, with the beginning of runway 25 right. And it has the markings for normal runway, as you expected, obviously only begin at the displaced threshold or at the real threshold. And from the crew's perspective, arriving at this point, they must have believed that actually where they are is the actual beginning of the runway, and that's from where the 3,000 meters they had available start. What isn't made clear in the accident report is how that information was being displayed to them on their onboard laptop they had for performance calculations. It's not quite clear how that was being shown, how that was being illustrated, but just looking at the situation, I think it's pretty easy to see how the crew was mistaken in thinking that they were actually at the beginning of the runway when the performance system was based on a performance starting at the displaced threshold.
But you were just saying that the captain was very experienced, 15,000 flight hours, many, many years, even decades of experience, and a displaced threshold. That is, to put it bluntly, that's rather a beginner's error.
Maybe it is, but we are basically facing two choices, if you think about it. I mean, if you look at all the mistakes that were being done in this accident, they are basically beginner's mistakes. If you look at how the takeoff was rejected beyond V1 instead of ahead of V1, or the takeoff should have been continued, how not all the braking devices were used to bring the aircraft to a stop, you basically have three mistakes that in a simulator check would probably lead to a fail, that are really the maneuvers during a takeoff are trained in every simulator, they are being checked, they are part of every simulator check. And so I believe that you could call all three of them beginner's mistake. Now the problem is how are you going to deal with that? You can either go the way of looking at the flight hours and saying, okay, the crew was so experienced, they shouldn't have made that mistake, therefore we conclude they were incompetent. The problem is, in that case, you're not going to learn anything from that event. The other approach is that you say, okay, these crew were probably just average crew and I just need to find out why they made these mistakes. In essence, the finding of human error should never be the ending point of an investigation. I think you will agree with that. It should always be the starting point of an investigation. And if you do that, and if you ask yourself, why could this particular error happen to that particular crew, then you actually start to learn about why these events happened.
And what did the investigators find out? What, as the main cause, what I refer to as the error one?
They don't specifically spell out an error one, but I think you could look at the reason why they rejected the takeoff in the first place. That you look at why they misdiagnosed the bird strike as a full engine failure when it was just an engine stall. And for that, there are a couple of things why the crew rejected the takeoff, or the captain decided to reject the takeoff. There's just when this event occurred, it made itself known through a loud bang, and the flight engineer actually called "wow." He was probably also felt that it was pretty intense.
Wow.
Yeah, well, no, wow. It's the flight engineer called out "wow," and so I guess it was pretty intense for the entire crew. So there was a bit of a startle factor, meaning that you need a second to fully understand what's going on. Engine stalls have been described as being almost like a shotgun fired next to your head, being that loud. So that in itself may already have triggered an immediate response without much thinking, without much analysis. At the same time, the aircraft was passing through an area of the runway where the slope increased a little bit, meaning that the runway became a little bit steeper, and it might have looked to the crew as if it was losing speed already. So you have two cognitive inputs that basically may have prompted the crew to react to whatever was happening. And then you had to prior experience of the captain. The captain had previously experienced a real engine failure during a takeoff at an Incheon. And that engine failure was also preceded by a loud bang. This particular
And that was a true engine failure, not a burst strike?
That was a true engine failure.
Okay.
That was actually what happened. It doesn't say how it turned out, how the crew reacted to it, at which speed it happened, but the accident report clearly stated that the captain had had this prior experience not so long ago. In fact, this particular aircraft had logged 27 engine-related incidents from 2004 to 2008 when the accident occurred.
No, that's quite a number, I would say.
Yeah, and it doesn't state specifically that they were all engine failures, but apparently there had been 27 problems with that particular engine, and the crew will probably have been very aware of that. In fact, the entire Kalitta Air fleet had 12 engine problems during takeoff between 2006 and 2008. So in only 2 years, 12 engine problems during takeoffs.
From your perspective, I personally have my personal opinion, but from your perspective, is that normal or is that rather unusual?
I can tell you that in my 8,000 flying hours, I never had an engine failure.
Me neither.
Not a single
Only
one.
a simulator.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the most trained for maneuvers, but it's also extremely rare maneuvers on modern engines. And having so many engine problems in such a long period of time is really
a short period of time. 2 years is not much. I mean,
no.
so many engine failures with a rather small fleet compared internationally. That's rather unusual.
Furthermore, 4 of these events involved this particular aircraft. I mean, before we were talking about the whole fleet of Kalitta Air, which is still a lot, but 4 involved this particular aircraft. So every 6 months you had an engine problem during takeoff on this particular aircraft. And that's really quite a lot. And although it didn't really have any bearing on this particular accident, well, it did have a bearing on this particular accident, possibly, but that engine that was affected by the bird strike had recently been replaced after it had given a fire warning. So again, no matter if you look at the entire fleet or this particular aircraft or this particular engine, you're looking at a history of trouble. And the crew will have had that in their mind, basically, when they did that takeoff. So from that perspective, I think that made it more likely that the crew was kind of spring-loaded towards reacting to an engine failure.
Yes, you just said it's important to go away from the last slice of cheese, what I describe as the active failure of the active pilots on that particular event. So starting to investigate where the error chain started, trying to find systemic errors. And we already learned that there were a number of mistakes and errors done which led up to this accident. But obviously, it was waiting to happen because so many things, obviously, in this airline did not work the way we might assume it should work, or that the technical standard of the engines of the old 747s, which what I learned is that they purchased them not new, but they tried to get, I put it my way, just the cheapest one on the market, and then they bought some pretty old airplanes which were prone to have some technical problems or malfunctions. So it was an error waiting to happen, or an accident waiting to happen. Is that what you would call a systemic error, or is there a problem with their safety or error culture in this company?
Well, it's difficult to say from the accident report, and unfortunately, and I think that's something you and I would have looked into, but it seems that the accident investigators only looked at this particular event, and then at the data that the airline had for their own engine failures. But it doesn't seem like they looked for the reasons of that. They do say that the Pratt & Whitney's JT9D engines that the 747-200 used had a higher failure rate than comparable engines from other manufacturers, but they don't really go into how organizational factors or organizational decisions may have affected that. But it really seems odd that they have so many engine failures without actually doing anything about that. I think you would expect from a safety-conscious management, you would expect that looking at the data, at some point they say, look, we really need to do something here. We need to get more modern equipment. We can't keep doing that.
That would certainly, you rightly said, you and me, we would have looked at this particularly, knowing now from hindsight that exactly 6 weeks later, after this accident, this wrong takeoff abort in Brussels with the broken up airplane with a full hull loss, there was another accident with a Kalitta Air 747 operating for Centurion Air in Bogota. They were taking off in Bogota with a destination going to Miami. They had a shipment of flowers on board, and right after takeoff, they again, believe it or not, had an engine failure.
Okay.
And not only a single engine failure, they had one engine which failed, engine number 4, but then again, for reasons which could not be identified, engine number 1 did not work as planned as well. And then the airplane basically crashed, killing one person on ground, but the flight deck or the pilots on board, they all survived, fortunately. The rest of the airplane was burned, was full hull loss. And this only happened 6 weeks later. Nicholas, from my perspective, it screams that there are systematic problems within this company, which all led up to a situation where they were waiting for things to happen.
I would agree. And I mean, you could argue that the airline, in this particular event here in Brussels, that the airline had no influence over a bird entering an engine. This was a coincidence. But how the crew was set up for that was basically because of the history they had with engine problems.
Excellent. Okay. Do you know any changes that occurred or happened at the airline after that? Is there anything that we know how if the pilot training was improved and how the crews were thereafter trained in simulators to handle rejected takeoffs? Is there anything known that maybe the safety culture or anything within the company has changed thereafter?
So there were a couple of actions, a couple of safety care recommendations that came out, and like you already suspected, they did look at their training. They reviewed and improved their training for engine failures and for rejected takeoffs. Having said that, I'm not 100% sure if they were really addressing the problem, because I don't think it was so much of a training issue, but like you said, an organizational issue, a systemic issue related to engine failures in general. The accident investigators included a section of their manuals in the accident report, and it clearly spells out what you would find in any airline's manuals about rejected takeoff, that after V1 you don't reject the takeoff, before V1 you're probably better off rejecting the takeoff, and that is a critical decision. So I'm not sure if any additional training or review of that particular paragraph will actually improve things. That's not addressing the systemic issue. That's really limiting yourself to addressing the individual and trying to find something that you can show as evidence of your willingness to improve safety. But I don't think it really got to the point of it.
To the core, yeah, I absolutely agree. There were so many other things that, like missing out that they were doing an intersection takeoff, and then when they did the takeoff abort, they didn't use all the possibilities for a full thrust reverse, speed brakes, full brakes. Nothing of that had really happened, and this all happened to an experienced pilot. So it's a very, very unfortunate error chain that led up to this very unfortunate accident. But you and me, I think we both agree that there must have been some systemic problem within the company, whether it's been a cultural issue or safety culture or wrong error culture, which is not present. We really don't know. Unfortunately, the investigation report does not dive too deep into this. So this concludes this accident of Kalitta Air of the 747 in Brussels, and I really appreciate all your expertise and your explaining the accident that had happened. Let's talk about about your own projects. You're about to publish a new episode of your own podcast, the essence of safety. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's right. I'm going somewhere where I've never been before. In the next episode of Essence of Safety, we are going to explore the thin line between taking responsibility and self-blame. And we are looking at two very different accidents for that. We are looking at the crash of a Japan Airlines DC-8 in San Francisco in the 1960s. And then we are going to look at the collision between a US Navy submarine and a Japanese fishing trawler.
Well, that's interesting. It's very different, very different. You have
absolutely.
an airplane and you have a submarine.
And it took me a long time to actually wrap my head around different things on how navigation works on submarines, how they detect other vessels and other submarines. And it really took me a long time to really get to the bottom of it. But what we're actually looking at is we ask the question, when things go wrong, yes, it is important to take responsibility. But at which point does that turn into self-blaming? And how does self-blaming then stop us from learning and understanding what happened? And that's basically the topic of that particular podcast, which I hope to publish in the next coming days.
Excellent. I'm very, very excited, particularly looking at so very, very different occurrences or accidents and trying to figure out where are the parallels, where are similarities. So I'm really excited. I will be putting your episode and the link to the Essence of Safety in the podcast description for this episode. And once again, I really appreciate it. And thank you very much for your time. I'm very excited for your episode. And to all the listeners, also go to the Essence of Safety, download it, and listen to this podcast. It will be interesting, for sure.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Niklas, thank you very much. You've been listening to Arrow 1. If the story moved you, like it and share it. And remember, sometimes the biggest disasters start with a small decision or even a smaller bird. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and see you next time. Bye-bye.